I want to start by saying what a privilege it is to be speaking alongside such esteemed fellow panelists. And I also want to start by paying my respects to everybody, not just today, but in the past, who has waged a courageous battle against racism, institutionalized racism, and against capitalism. I think it's important to recognize the wider context that has given rise to this wave of struggle, which is the deep crisis of global capitalism, which has accelerated the massive growth of inequality and economic insecurity. Just to give you one of many stunning facts, from a recent Federal Reserve study on the financial well-being of Americans, we see 47% in the wealthiest country in the history of humanity say that they would not have the resources to meet an unexpected expense of $400. They would have to sell something or borrow to meet that need if they could meet it at all. And these statistics are even more stark and heartbreaking when we look at what's happened to the Black community. The biggest loss of wealth has been for Black people since the recession, since the economic recession, and it has also been the biggest loss of wealth since slavery. This is the system we're living in, where 40% of the children of color in the United States are living in deep poverty. And in all of this, in all of these economic statistics are embedded the absolutely outrageous facts of what life is, what day-to-day life is like for Black people, for the people of color. Living in decades of brutalization, the war, the systematic war on Black people, the demonizing of Black people, and the demonizing of poor people. This is the context in which this struggle is starting to emerge. And we've seen these waves of struggle begin, in more prominent way through the public sector uprising in Wisconsin in 2011, which started against Scott Walker's attacks on union rights and the vicious austerity agenda, which the Democratic Party establishment did not help fight against. And this wave of struggle went on to express itself through the Occupy movement and the environmental movement, the massive People's Climate March in New York City last September. And it is right now being expressed through this enormously courageous and militant Black Lives Matter movement. And I think there is nothing more clarifying than the Black Lives Matter movement to show us who are the agents of social change, who are the agents of a fight back against a brutal social and economic agenda. It is not the Democratic Party establishment. It is not the Black misleaders that Glenn correctly talked about. It is the young people, the young Black people, young people of color, who not only have put out a clarion call for a militant struggle, but they have boldly rejected these ossified layers of the so-called leadership. It was the family of Akai Gurley who told Sharpton to go home and that did not want his traveling circus. And it was the sustained and determined revolt of people, especially young people, that has finally led to a small but significant victory, where in Baltimore, 6 police officers have been indicted, have been arrested. And I think that the questions we face are not only the question of whether or not this is inspiring, because there is no question that this is inspiring, there is no question that this is critical, but the question that we face that faces all of us in society. This is not just the obligation or the responsibility of the black community. This is our collective responsibility, as Alicia and other speakers have so clearly and eloquently enunciated. Our question, the question to our society is, how are we going to defeat institutional racism, which itself is ultimately the legacy of slavery, the legacy of imperialism, and the legacy of capitalism? How will we wage a successful war against police brutality, against mass incarceration, against the dehumanization and virtual extinguishing of black lives and black spirit, and the spirits of poor people, the spirits of all people of color? How will we fight against the social depression, the deep underlying social deprivation that has blighted so many of our communities? How will we wage a fight for, as Alicia said, for dignity and self-determination? How are we going to do this? Because the struggle for black liberation is a question that is facing, as I said, not just black people, but all of us, all of the broader layers of the working class. Because unless defeating structural and institutional racism and absolutely ending it off the face of this earth, unless this is an integral part of the agenda of a broader movement of working people and the oppressed, we have no hope of winning any kind of fundamental social change away from capitalism. And unless we do that, and unless we actually embrace that as part of our struggle, as integral to our struggle against capitalism, the structures of racism themselves will remain intact, because unless we defeat capitalism, racism will not be defeated. Because as Malcolm X said, you can't have capitalism without racism. And therefore, I join my sisters and brothers on the panel in making the call that the struggle for black liberation has to be all of our struggle. But it's also important for us to begin the conversation to concretely lay out a program of action for ourselves, not only for this year, but in the near future. Because unless we channel this massive and righteous outrage and anger that we all feel, unless we channel that into organized, collective struggle that can ultimately win victories, concrete victories against the system in the teeth of massive opposition from the ruling class, we're not going to be able to hold on to this moment for very long. There is an incredible historic moment right now, and it is our obligation as the left to seize on it. But how can we do it? I think we need to build the black liberation movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, into a cohesive national movement that takes on concrete political demands and empowers and indeed demands that the broader layers of the working class join us in this movement. I think one of the most important steps that are upcoming for us is the National Conference of the Black Lives Matter movement in Cleveland, Ohio on July 24th to 26th. Our movement needs to use this conference and many such other national meetings to call for concrete political demands with the idea of raising the banner of a larger struggle, an organized collective struggle. And what demands might they be? Some of them have already been elucidated. The community control of police by democratically elected bodies is absolutely critical and central. And we have to be clear, this is not a symbolic demand. This needs to be an actual demand where we say that these democratically elected bodies of our community that have our people, black people on it, will have full powers over the police for hiring, firing, subpoenaing, to judicial inquiries, and the budget of the police departments. Our movement needs to call to tax the super wealthy and big corporations to not only fully fund public education, but specifically target the systematic racism in our public school system and wage a war against the betrayal of the Democratic Party that, just as an example, through Rahm Emanuel, has carried out a decimation of our black community in Chicago. We need to call, as others have said, for an immediate release of all political prisoners, but also an immediate release of those incarcerated, those hundreds of thousands incarcerated on nonviolent drug charges. We need to call for an attack on the military budget to fund youth job programs and living wage unionized jobs for all working people. But my sisters, brothers, we also need to take this struggle that we are building on the streets, in the workplaces, this endeavor to build mass movements, we need to take this into the political space as well. Because as long as we, who are building a struggle against capitalism, as long as we cede the halls of power, whether it's in the City Hall of Seattle or in US Congress or in the White House, as long as we cede those halls of power to those very people who have carried out this oppression of us, we are not going to win. That's right. And that is why our struggle to build mass movements has to be joined by a very clear call for an independent political alternative to the Democrats and Republicans. And we need to make it clear what kind of political formation we are talking about. We don't want a party that is independent in name and ends up funneling to the very parties that are carrying out our oppression. We want working people, poor people, oppressed people, black people, and people of color to be at the leadership of this call to build a new political party. And we want this party to be rooted in the mass movements that we're building. And we want the party to legitimize the leaders who have already proven their selflessness in fighting for the movement. We want this political formation to not only take on the demands that are intricately tied to the question of the brutality against black people, but also, as others have said, tie it to all the social and economic demands that we know are completely tied to why black people experience police brutality. It's not in a vacuum of society. It's happening in the context of the systematic impoverishment of black people. So these demands have to be taken up. But at the end of the day, my sisters and brothers, unless we take on the serious call to be truly independent of the establishment parties, and let me say again, truly independent of the Democratic Party, we will not succeed. And just to clarify, I don't repeat Republican as much as Democrat because I assume everybody's clear about the role of the Republican Party. The confusion in many people's minds lies in the role of the Democratic Party. And I wanted to, as my last piece, to share with you something I hope some of you already know, but to lay out some of the general points that I feel come up from our historic success in Seattle. When Socialist Alternative, which is a nationwide organization of social and economic justice activists, when we launched our campaign for city council in 2013, we were very much rooted in the movement. I personally came out of the Occupy Seattle movement, and we laid out a campaign program, a campaign manifesto, once again, that took its lead from young workers, many of them young black workers, who walked out right here in Manhattan in November 2012, calling for 15 and a union. And we threw out all the conventional rules that we were told that grassroots movements and grassroots campaigns have to follow. They told us, be timid. We were audacious. They told us, don't say you're a socialist. We said we're socialists at every step of the way. They said, don't raise the banner of racial injustice so high, you're going to alienate other working people. We raised the banner of racial justice so high, and we confirmed our suspicions, which is that the broader layers of the working class are completely in solidarity on the demands for racial justice. We were told we have to take money from anybody who's willing to fund our campaign. We declared we are an anti-corporate, pro-working people's campaign that will not take a penny from big business. And all this, my friends, is not to make a simplistic claim that every campaign that we run is going to look identical, or that we would even win in every campaign that we run. But it is to illustrate that our victory, the victories on $15 an hour nationwide, and the emergence of a militant black struggle rooted in young people's movement, all of these collectively are indications of this historic moment that we're in that will pass if we don't seize on it immediately. And I also wanted to illustrate what we can do if we win power at every level. Just to give you an example of what's happening in Seattle. Coincidentally, with the emergence of the BLM movement, we've also seen an attack by the Seattle establishment on young black people through a campaign to build a new youth jail, to spend $210 million building a youth jail. We tied our city council voice very closely, completely, to the Black Lives Matter movement in Seattle, which has been waging a valiant struggle against the youth jail. And it will come as no surprise, hopefully, to all of you here, that even though the entire city council, as Paul said, other than me, is Democratic Party, I was the only vote against the youth jail. And this should be a reminder, a sober reminder for us that we have no hope, once again, unless we build independent struggles. And we are also in a city, in Seattle, where the police department is under a consent decree by the Department of Justice for systematic excessive use of force and systematic racial targeting. We are fighting against that. I was the only no vote against the appointment of the police chief, the new police chief, who is, for appearances, somewhat different, but as events have borne us out, is part of the same establishment. I offer these examples with an appeal to everybody, not just in this room, but out there, who want to build a struggle, who are looking for a way forward, that we can build an enormous fighting movement, not just in the United States, but globally. As Tanjube correctly said, this has to be a global struggle. We can do this, but for that, it will require us to carry out a principled leadership where we are clear that the establishment, no matter whether they're D or R, are stacked against us. They represent the ruling class, we represent the working class and the poor, and that our interests are fundamentally, diametrically opposed to each other, and there is no meeting ground. and that we have to build an independent struggle. Solidarity.